Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. Well, I'm delighted that today I am joined by Stef Benstead. Stef is an independent researcher in social security and disability and is herself dependent upon benefit due to a genetic chronic illness. She's currently studying for Masters in Theology, Community Development and Social Change at Nazarene Theological College, and has recently brought out her second book, Just Worship, Worshipping God by Living Just Lives. That sounds like a book I'd very much like to read, Stef. It's so great to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So as I was just prepping for this, I discovered that you are going to be speaking at Greenbelt in a few weeks' time. And Greenbelt is increasingly gaining traction as being one of the central places where issues of social justice and politics are brought into conversation with faith. So I'm guessing that my kind of standard question, which is, do these things belong together, is probably going to have a fairly positive answer from you. But why don't you tell us just a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Yes, so I think I've tended to take the position that if you think that politics doesn't really have a place in the pulpit or in Christian speaking and preaching, then that might suggest that you are perhaps quite well off and comfortable at the moment, and that politics is working for you, and that the reason you don't think it's particularly important or doesn't have a place is that it's not causing you any problems. So you think it's working well, and it's not really you don't realize how important it is to your life, so therefore you think it's not really relevant to Christianity. Whereas if you are struggling, so if you've got someone like me who is dependent upon social security, so I'm acutely aware of the assessment processes for claiming social security, of the problems with those, the challenges of getting access to benefits, of what it's like trying to live on that level of benefits, which isn't enough. Like, I can only ever get by if I have other sources of people helping me out, or if I've got a book that I managed to sell some copies. Or if you are struggling in an area of deprivation and there's not really any good jobs around, or the schools are struggling and the NHS is struggling, and you can see all the problems and you don't have a lot of there's not a lot of difference that you can make because the options just aren't available to you, then it's a lot more clear that politics is important, and that the policies that the government makes and the way that they have arranged for the economy to work and for society to be set up actually is important. And then you might start thinking, well, what does God have to say about how society should be set up? Does it bother God if some people are really rich and some people are really poor? When there is poverty, does God think that that is poor people's fault, or does he have more to say about how the rich people are living and what the leaders of society are doing? And if there is injustice, if you can't work and it's not your fault, is there a just system that you can get access to money? If you're looking for work, is there a just system that has ensured there are decent jobs? If you're trying to get your children educated, has the system ensured there's a good education available for them? You're going to have all those questions, and they're going to be relevant to you, and it'll be, I would hope, it would make a lot more sense to you that Christianity might actually have something to say to this, particularly if you go and then read the Old Testament. So my book, Just Worship, is looking particularly at the law and the prophets. And it is asking that question of, what does God say justice is? What does God say about justice? What does his words to his people say about his character and about what he thinks is right and about what he thinks is important in society? And I think because I grew up as a Christian, so I grew up knowing my Bible quite well, reading it a lot, studying it a lot as a teenager, I couldn't help seeing the role of justice in the Bible, God's concern about poverty, God's concern about people who are struggling. And the idea, therefore, that politics isn't relevant to Christianity just doesn't make any sense to me. And it definitely doesn't make sense if you're someone for whom politics isn't working. And I think that's why I sort of think, if you don't think politics is important, perhaps that can only come because politics is currently working for you. But if politics isn't working for you, it's a lot more obvious that there are problems.
Thank you. That's a really helpful perspective and a very challenging one, I think. Well, before we get into the meat of our conversation, let me just run through the news headlines as they stand on Monday as we're recording. And it's quite a fast-moving situation at the moment in the UK. So following the dreadful attacks in Southport a week ago, which resulted in the murders of Bebe King, age 6, Elsie Stancombe, age 7, and Elise Aguiar, age 9, and 5 children and 2 adults being put into hospital in very serious condition, and I haven't heard an update on their health recently. Following that, there was a kind of social media disinformation wave that came out very quickly, making claims about somebody who had a fictitious individual who had allegedly perpetrated that dreadful crime. And when the name of the person who has been arrested and charged, and of course not yet found guilty, was finally released a couple of days later, by then there was a huge amount of disorder already building up, which began in Southport and has now overflowed into Hull, Liverpool, Bristol, Manchester, Stoke-on-Trent, Blackpool and Belfast. On Saturday, Sunday in Rutherland, Tamworth, Middlesbrough, Bolton, Hull and Weymouth. The police attended 56 gatherings of the far right, all counter-protesters, over just those 2 days. 250 arrests have been made. And the breaking news this morning on Monday is that the Prime Minister is about to chair a COBRA meeting. Moving further away, at least 200 people have been killed in a series of anti-government protests in Bangladesh, which started a few weeks ago with calls to abolish quotas in civil service jobs, but has now transformed into a much wider anti-government movement. A couple of days ago, 24 prisoners were exchanged between the USA and Russia in the largest prisoner swap since the Cold War. In the Middle East, tensions are only rising as Israel has assassinated the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Iran and a key commander of the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. The US is sending jets and warships to the region, and meanwhile the bombing is continuing in Gaza. Perhaps slightly more cheerfully, but actually no less controversially, perhaps, is what's going on in the Olympics at the moment. Andy Murray has now retired from tennis, tweeting, "Never liked tennis anyway." Adam Peaty has had a mixed week, complicated by COVID, and has spoken openly about how his Christian faith has helped him through the dark days following Tokyo 2020. 2 boxers who failed gender tests but are biologically female have been the centre of claim and counterclaim by gender-critical and trans activists on social media. And for the first time, an athlete from the refugee team has won an Olympic medal as the boxer Cindy Ngamba secures a certain medal, although at the time of recording, the colour of that remains to be determined. It's also International Youth Day on the 12th of August. Well, there's a few things to provide some background to our conversation, Stef. Let me just run through what the lectionary readings are before we start discussing them in detail. I'm going to come to the Old Testament one in just a moment, but we've got Ephesians chapter 4, verses 25 to chapter 5, verse 2, which is where the apostle is giving instructions to the church about their conduct around a range of things, which we'll probably pick up in our conversation. And we've got John chapter 6, verses 35 and 41 to 51, which picks up the Bread of Life discourse, which Simon and I were discussing last week. We've got Psalm 130, which is a song of ascent, meaning a song that pilgrims would have sung as they climbed the hill towards the temple in Jerusalem. And the first one we're going to discuss is 2 Samuel 18. Now, the verses allocated in the lectionary are verses 5 to 9, 15, and 31 to 33. But I have to say that I'm a bit shocked that the lectionary has dropped right into what is effectively the end of quite a long narrative arc. And it's not going to make much sense if we don't read it with at least the preceding, 6 or 7 chapters in mind. So let me just put that in context before we then, Steph and I, begin to discuss it. So the allocated reading is the death of Absalom. Absalom is David's son, probably David's favourite son, and Absalom is seriously disaffected at the beginning of this arc, and that stems from the rape of his full sister Tamar by their half brother Amnon, and David's disinclination to get involved in justice for Tamar and any sort of sanction against Amnon. So Absalom is very angry about that, eventually murders Amnon himself. And for 4 years, he has been stirring up trouble against his father. Let me just read you 2 or 3 verses from 2 Samuel 15. Which perhaps demonstrate what's going on here. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Amnon would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way towards all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And having stolen the hearts of the people of Israel, he then launches a civil war against his father, displacing David from Jerusalem for a time. This is the very end of the story, and this is where Absalom is on the run. Finally, he gets his wonderful hair, which is his crowning glory, quite literally, gets caught in a tree, and Joab, David's henchman, finds him and kills him. And we, at the end of this reading, we have David weeping for his son, whom he loved all along. So I wanted to put that in context because I don't think the reading is going to make any sense on its own. Okay, let's start discussing then. So Steph, as you looked at these texts, did you see themes that ran through more than one of them?
I felt that one of the big themes was compassion. So we've gone through the history of Absalom and David's relationship and the problems going on there, but the bit that you get from the passage that was read is David's compassion for Absalom and his love for Absalom, even though this son has killed one of his other sons and launched a coup against him. He actually still says to Joab and the other military commanders, "Please don't kill Absalom." And when he finds out that Absalom has been killed, he is deeply grieved. So you can see a compassion there that I wonder if, well, it does parallel God's compassion for us, that we're like Absalom in our rejection of God, our desire to go our own way and rule our own lives. And yet he still has great compassion for us. And we can see that also in the Psalm 130, when David is saying, "If you, O Lord, kept track of iniquities, then who could stand? But with you is forgiveness." And that's really important because we all need that forgiveness. We've all sinned, we've all rejected and disobeyed God. And we cannot have a relationship with him unless he forgives us. And then David also says, "so that you may be feared." And I think that it's easy to think that forgiveness is a really light thing, that it sort of means we get away with sin. But actually that's not what happened, because God is also a God of justice and actions have consequences. Absalom's actions meant that a number of the Israelite men died because there was a battle between the two sides. David's failure to enact justice when Amnon raped Tamar is then what led to this whole situation. So a failure to create justice is also a problem. It leaves people feeling upset often. They've been wronged. It led to Absalom taking action into his own hands because he thought justice hadn't been done when it should have been done. And we know that ultimately God can't just be unjust. We wouldn't want him to be. I don't think there's anyone really who would like to think that if Adolf Hitler had genuinely repented on his deathbed, that he could have just got into heaven without any form of punishment for his absolutely wicked crimes.
Well, that's an interesting point.
And then actually, but that is the point of Jesus' death, was that he took the punishment for us. So all sin has been punished because Jesus took it. And I apologize if I don't quite use the exact right theological word.
Yeah,
But the point is that God didn't just go, oh, it doesn't matter that you sinned and rejected me. He had to also make sure that justice happened. And that is what allows us to be forgiven. And I think when we forget the role of justice and the role of making restitution, so this isn't in the lectionary, but if you think about Zacchaeus, when he was brought to realize his sin, he made restitution by saying, I will repay everyone from whom I've essentially stolen, and I will give back more than I stole. So he was making restitution, and that is what led Jesus to say, like, salvation has come to this house. So I think that is really important for understanding God's compassion for us, that he finds a way for justice to still happen, that we can be forgiven, but that forgiveness is a really serious, weighty thing, not to be taken lightly. And sometimes when I think about things that I've seen God's forgiveness for in my own life, I almost find it a bit scary because of how serious and important it is. But it enables me to understand God's love for me, and it enables me to show that love to other people, which you also kind of see in the Ephesians passage about being truthful, about don't sin when we're angry, don't steal, but work and try to do good for others, try and build other people up, bring grace to people, be kind and compassionate and forgiving. So in that Ephesians passage, we've got, again, like, I guess, a drawing out of what does that compassion and love and forgiveness mean? How do we actually deal with each other? So I think, yeah, that compassion, but also not forgetting the importance of justice is probably the themes that I would try and get from all those passages together.
Great, thank you. Well, let's look at them one at a time, and let's go back to the narrative, the 2 Samuel 18 narrative. You've already drawn some things out for us. Are there other things that you'd like to point out to us?
So I think, I suppose I did talk about it, but I think it's that thing about justice, which in our current context is so important, that David didn't take action against Amnon when Amnon raped Tamar. That was wrong of David not to do that. That then made Absalom feel that he had the right to take action, but the problem is he didn't have that right. And I feel really nervous to talk on such a complex ground of the current riots in society, because I haven't gone out and rioted, so I don't, want to feel like I could explain the motives of the people who have rioted. But at least some of the commentary that I see is that there is a feeling amongst the people who go out and riot that justice isn't being done, that they are upset about changes happening in the country, and the failure of the police or the government to act on those in the way that they think would be right, and that therefore the time has come for them to take matters into their own hands and to make it clear that they don't think the way the police and the government have acted is, or fails to act, is okay. But the problem is that it's never okay to use violence and intimidation and threat and damage as a way to try and get our own message across, or as a response to something that we think is wrong. It's also very much not the way of God. God didn't look at our sin and go, well, that's it, I'm just going to come out and wage war against all of you because we'd just be obliterated. if he did, and in fact, I think it's Peter, someone talks about how God is patient, and the reason he hasn't obliterated us all now is because he wants more people to have time to come to faith in him. I've forgotten what I was going to say. But yeah, so God's means of bringing justice wasn't to wage war, but was for him to come and to take the penalty and be the one who died, was to sacrifice himself, and in that way to show love and to restore justice. God's way is always the way of giving up power, not using power to impose his own will on people. So the riots that we've seen, whether or not we agree with the people's motives, in the same way that whether or not we agree with sort of actions around Black Lives Matter or Just Stop Oil or some of the Palestinian marches, whatever the underlying motive, I think I'd want to say that force and violence isn't the right way to take. You can protest and you can make your feelings known in a way that doesn't cause harm to other people, because however good we think our goal is, it's never okay to use harmful means like that. And it's not the way that God would use. And it brings so much harm, like collateral damage to other people, that is not fair to impose on them.
Yeah, thank you. I was very struck as that narrative arc that I just traced out a couple of minutes ago, of how it highlights the way that violence breeds violence, and we tend to imitate one another. In fact, we often tend to exceed in our imitation, which is how violence continues to mount up. And it's interesting, isn't it? Nietzsche, I think, would talk about ressentiment, that kind of the pain that emerges from a sense of one's own failure or inferiority or lack of ability to kind of grab a foothold on justice and on power, which I think is exactly what Absalom's whipping up in that bit that I read from 2 Samuel 15. And it seems to me that's kind of a common link really between this whole civil war situation that we encounter here and the sorts of things that we're seeing going on in our streets right now. But that reciprocity of violence is what makes it so scary, isn't it? We've already seen counter protesters coming out, wanting, I think in the vast majority of situations, wanting absolutely to kind of stand peacefully and prevent harm. So that happened in Bristol, just in fact, directly opposite the sixth form centre where my girls went to school. There's a hotel there which is being used to house people who are asylum seekers, and there was a small mob appeared there, but as they appeared, they were met by counter protesters, and in fact the police were several minutes later getting there. And I gather that counter protest kind of prevented people from entering and perhaps causing harm to structures, but maybe also harm to people. But where am I going with this? But what I'm saying is that sometimes these counter protests flare up into violence in their own right, and I know that has also happened in the last few days, and we see exactly this sort of process, don't we, going on in this story as it unfolds. Okay, thank you. Well, why don't we go on to Ephesians chapter 4. I think I'm going to do what I did last week, actually, because this is another kind of collection of Paul's kind of greatest hits. It's just worth reading because it's so short. So let me just read it and then I'll ask your reflections on it, Stef. So the apostle says, "Be made new in the attitude of your minds and put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbour, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Your thoughts, Stef?
I think that's interesting again in how it speaks to the current riots, particularly like in your anger, do not sin, that you can betray whatever their reasons for being angry, that doesn't actually make it okay to then go and cause criminal damage and to harm people. And he's also saying that that's actually bad for you as a person. It gives the devil a foothold in your life in some way, and that's not good for you. So even for your own sake, you should be trying to avoid anger leading you into sin. And then he's also saying, you know, let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but try and build up one another and support one another. And how different a situation would that be if the people who are currently rioting were instead to stop and think, okay, I feel like this person is my enemy in some sense. Either I feel threatened by their presence, or I feel that they have a position of power and responsibility that they're not using correctly, and therefore they are opposed to my interests. What if you were to stop and say, actually, how would I build this person up? How would I say things that are beneficial for these people? So rather than just being angry and using force, what would be the form of words that would be useful for the people with whom I disagree? Because if you want someone to come round to your point of view, that doesn't generally happen through force and violence. It's more likely to happen by sitting down and having a conversation, being willing to listen to their side of the story, being interested in their experiences and the evidence they're using and the weight they're putting on that evidence to reach their position, being interested enough to ask questions, and then when you present your side, not trying to insult the other person or imply that their view is not it's like a stupid one to hold, but to take them seriously and listen to them. And I suppose then again, the other way around, a lot of commentators that I'm seeing aren't giving that respect to the people who are doing the rioting, and it's quite easy to go, well, look, they're violent thugs. We're not interested in why they're doing it, because they shouldn't be doing it. And sure, they shouldn't be doing it. But we should still have respect for people as humans. I've been reading a book called The Politics of God by Catherine Tanner, and she's been talking about how, because everyone is a creation of God made in his image, then the opinions that we form, the judgments and the decisions that we come to based on the evidence that we have available to us and the weight that we put on that evidence are inherently worthy of respect, and we are still worthy of respect just because we are humans in the image of God, and he's given us cognitive and reasoning ability and the dignity, and we should respect that in other people even when we disagree with that views. So we need the people who are angry with the protesters to be willing to give them some degree of respect and not go, this is a stupid, violent thug, but to go, this is a person who has come to particular viewpoints because of their experiences and the evidence they've come across and the weight they put on it. And we might feel that they should have looked at other evidence and been exposed to other viewpoints, but we also have our own biases and our own flaws and fallibility. And it's not helpful to assume that we are better at this sort of reasoning ability than them, because then we are giving ourselves like a superiority that allows us to be rude and demeaning to them over there, which is exactly what we're objecting to in them, that we don't like their behaviour, and then but it's okay for us to be rude and demeaning to them because they're inferior and we're superior, and that's not really not okay. So how do we be kind and considerate? How do we ensure that we don't sin against the people who are doing the rioting? How do we make sure that when we speak to them, we are speaking words that will build them up and be beneficial to them? Again, I suppose coming back then to the justice thing, you know, in your anger, don't sin. These people have sinned in their rioting. That is wrong. Justice does need to happen. Not in an uneven way where some groups get punished more for the same action than other groups. That's not justice. But nevertheless, we do need to be able to say to the rioters, your actions are not okay. Whatever your reasons for them, those actions aren't okay. But I think we still need to give these people the dignity of saying how you feel is still important, and we should be willing to engage in those conversations where we don't have any unwholesome talk and where we seek to build one another up and bring grace. And that's really hard, particularly if we are really upset with the actions of the other side.
Yeah.
But that is the kind of peace and sacrifice and love for the other person that God calls us to.
Thank you. I'm going to add some thoughts from my own recent research, actually, because I think it's relevant here. So I'm the editor of a book that's coming out next month called The Church, the Far Right and the Claim to Christianity. And following some research project, we've got 10 concrete recommendations to make to the church about how the UK church might respond to the growing rise of the far right in this country. One of those recommendations, excuse me, actually, there were two that I think is worth pointing out. One is the virtue of curiosity, of trying to understand why some of these ideologies grow and you know, the structural injustice that fosters these ideologies. And to understand that so often it's the kind of metropolitan elite. It's people like, well, I'll plead guilty. You can tell me if you plead guilty, Stef. But you know, people who are relatively privileged, perhaps, and have a good education, and it kind of taps on something you were saying right at the very beginning of our conversation, actually. And we tend to talk down and kind of label such people as bigots without listening to and trying to understand why they are like they are. And a related recommendation is that as the church seeks to, I don't think anyone can fairly accuse the UK church of not being interested in matters of poverty and not being interested in matters relating to asylum seekers and refugees and so on. But quite often these are held in different parts of the church and can sometimes even compete for, well, do sometimes have to compete for funding or compete for people's kind of attention and interest in prayer. And one of our recommendations is that we look increasingly to try and join these things up so that there isn't a sense of competition between what we might call you know, poverty relief among what we might call indigenous British people and poverty relief among those who have joined us more recently. So I'll just flag that up because I think that seems quite relevant to the conversation that we've been having. Should we go on to John chapter 6, the bread of life, second half of the bread of life discourse? What are your thoughts here?
So from this passage, I think you see the importance of God's role in our life and our need for him above all else, that he is the one who sustains us and looks after us and supports us. So I suppose going back to the compassion theme is God's understanding of our need for him and his willingness to support us and look after us.
Wonderful, thank you. I mean, it's such a rich theme, passage, isn't it? But I think we won't linger on this one because we've had quite a long conversation about some of the others. If anybody is listening and didn't hear Simon Woodman on the first half of the Bread of Life passage in last week's podcast, then it would be worth going back and having a listen to that, I think. Should we go on to the Psalm, Steph?
Mm-hmm.
So Psalm 130, a song of ascents. What catches your attention here?
So I talked about that a bit at the start, didn't I, about if God kept track of our sin, we'd never be able to stand before him. But because of his forgiveness, which he brought about with justice through Jesus' death on the cross, that is how God is able to bring his love and his justice together, which is so important. And because of that love that God has for us, you can see the psalmist is saying, like, he will wait for God and long for God, that, you know, more than the watchman. So if you imagine you're awake in the middle of the night and you're the one who's having to keep guard, but it's the middle of the night, your body really wants to be asleep and you're desperately trying to stay awake and keep watch and not think that every bird that stirs is an enemy, but also be aware in case there is an enemy. And you're just like, I just really want it to be morning so that I can stop having to worry about whether I'm about to be attacked, and I can go to sleep and have a rest and enjoy the daylight where I can see what's actually going on. That kind of longing in the middle of the night when you really want to be asleep but you have to be awake. That is the kind of longing that the psalmist is describing for God. And then he's also talking about, you know, put our hope in him. Like the translation that I've got here talks about God's loving devotion, and that he redeems us in abundance from all our sin, and just the magnificence of God's love for us and the richness of it, and the extent to which we can trust in him, and also we should delight in him and have that overflowing love back to him because of just how incredible he is.
Thank you. It's a beautiful psalm. I was caught by that metaphor of the watchman waiting, and also the opening verse, which speaks about out of the depths I cry to you. So there's two kind of dominant metaphors here. One is somebody being in the very, very deep, dark place, like the bottom of a well sort of thing. And the other one of as you say, this metaphor of night. And I'm going to ask you this question in a minute, actually, Steph, but as I pray for the world, these metaphors seem very relevant to me of those who are at the bottom of a well, in their mental health, in their economic circumstances. I think about those caught in situations of modern slavery, and those who are being bombed to obliteration, and so on. We could go on. This psalm has beautiful words of prayer which we can use when this is our own experience, but also we can pray with and on behalf of those for whom this is their current, the best working metaphor for their current life situation. Well, thank you, Steph. It's been great to have a conversation. Let me ask you an outgoing one then, which is, as I mentioned a moment ago, as you look around the country and the world, how are you praying in these days?
I'm praying a lot for wisdom. Like, there are so many difficult situations and thorny problems to think about. You know, Russia attacked Ukraine. How much military support does the West give to Ukraine without triggering Russia to attack us back? Does Russia have the capability to attack us back? If we don't support Ukraine and Russia wins, then what does that mean for other countries bordering on Russia? If we partially support Ukraine, but not quite enough for Ukraine to win, but enough to prolong the war, is that a good idea? So that's a really, really complicated matter. Then you've got Israel and Palestine, and is the West taking perhaps enough responsibility for our role in the creation of Israel, and therefore the impact on that area? How do we respond when each side is behaving at various times over a period of decades, has done quite atrocious acts? So both sides have done wrong things. One side is appears to be somewhat stronger than the other. And the riots in the UK, which seem to be coming out of some sense of grievance or feeling that justice hasn't been done. How do we respond to that and say rioting isn't okay? The sort of damage to key parts of community infrastructure and to people is not acceptable. But how do we also think about the fact that community is important, and that when I think about where I live or the church I'm at, the people who've lived on my street for years and years, or who've been going to my church for years and years, are the ones that I'm naturally going to form the strong relationships with, because there's the time to create them. Whereas the people who are only there for 2 or 3 years and then move away, once they've moved away, any relationship that you built up starts to dwindle, and that's not great for community. So how do we have the wisdom to build a country where people can have stability and that community that we all need? And if we don't do that because we aren't building social housing, perhaps, and people can't afford to stay in one place because they're constantly seeking a cheaper place to rent or a nicer place to rent because the landlord's not maintaining their home, how do we think about how all these things impact people's well-being and sense of community and sense of stability? And if people don't have that stability, how do they respond to it? And even when we know that how they've responded is wrong, we need to think about what led to it. So these are all very complicated issues where a lot of wisdom is needed to go, things have happened over decades that are probably wrong and shouldn't have happened. But we can't go back and change the past. We have to deal with the situation we've got now. How do we deal with what's in front of us now, and how do we build a better society and a better world so that we can try to cut off these problems at source? And those are really difficult things that no one's going to get right. There's always going to be problems, and we also need to have grace for one another and a willingness to believe that people are trying, most people are trying their best even when they get it wrong.
Thank you. Wisdom for our leaders, wisdom for our community leaders, wisdom for our church. Yeah, very important. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stef, for joining us today and for your insights. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you to those who've been listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on Twitter at Public Issues, or using #PoliticsInThePulpit. We also have a Facebook group which you can access through the Joint Public Issues team's Facebook page and the website jpit.uk. That's jpit.uk. I like to finish with some sort of final word of scripture or prayer, and as I was thinking about what to finish with today, it seemed to me that there is little that could be possibly more relevant than the words of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. May that be true of us.